for me?
It's great. Yes.
My son
Sabine.
Hello, Manus. How are you?
I'm very pleased and honoured to be able to announce the President of Ireland, Michael D. Higgins.
Dear friends, it's a great honour to be present here at the AGM of the International Brigade Memorial Trust. And your meeting is most appropriately taking place in Liberty Hall, the headquarters of Services Industrial, Professional and Technical Union, SIPTU. And may I thank Manus O'Riordan and the Memorial Trust for their invitation to me to join you today. And I would like in particular to welcome members of the organisation who have travelled from the United Kingdom and further afield to be here with us today. In fact, I was in London last night speaking about Eva Booth, so I'm not long back. It is fitting that we meet in Connolly, in the Connolly Hall of this historic and symbolic building, because it was here in 1936 that a group of activists gathered, bound together as they were by idealism, solidarity, internationalism, and above all courage, that would soon they would soon become members of the International Brigade. This month marks the 80th anniversary of the formation of the International Brigades, formally established by a decree of the Spanish Republic on the 18th of October 1936. And you know, as I know, and you know better than me, how around 40,000 international volunteers from more than 50 countries joined the brigades, and amongst them were 200 Irish-born volunteers, moved by the plight of the working classes of Spain and deeply concerned by the threat to democracy and the lengthening shadow of fascism that was spreading across Europe. They decided to volunteer for the International Brigade. Over 60 of these Irish internationalists would never come home. And part of my reason for being President of Ireland, or being as President of Ireland for being here this afternoon, is to honour them. The membership of the International Brigades were, in general, were drawn, as we know, from a wide range of social strata and occupations. Some of the members, like the novelist George Orwell or the poet W.H. Auden, or the former Church of Ireland minister Robert Hilliard, were intellectuals drawn from the middle classes, but most historical studies now agree that the vast majority of the Irish and British who joined the International Brigades were manual workers, but workers with an extraordinary sense of social and political justice and the importance of defending workers' rights wherever they were at stake. And as the research such as Angela Jackson and among others has shown, women, many of whom worked in medical units or relief organisations, and for that reason they played an important role in the International Brigades. The carnage of the working class in the trenches of World War I, in what was above all a contest of empires, was for many of them a fresh memory. But then too, the authoritarianism that was at its source, drawn from the culture of absolutist power that was fascism, was already thick in the air when they met and decided to join the brigades. And they sensed that. Ní hiad na star ha wanda horshin ar cartoif, a bheith buíocht dom tivis cuiv na coine brigadi internationalta. Ta buíchas tilja acha, o gach ilan dina agen, mar is iad cuní, cuivna na firis na man oherna gus sasanach, red Catrin, son den lahash, agus an aigan feshishtakas spó. As I have said in that old language of our own, which many of them spoke, not just historians, but all of us owe a debt of gratitude to the International Brigade Memorial Trust, who continue to keep alive the memory of the Irish and British men and women who so bravely fought to defend democracy and fight fascism in Spain. The death in January 2009 of Bob Doyle, whom I had the pleasure of meeting on a number of occasions with Michael O'Riordan and his colleagues, marked the passing of the last veteran of the Connolly column, reminding us of the role the Trust and all who support it play as important custodians of the history which has had such an important influence on the society in which we now live. So we must be grateful to the Memorial Trust for their untiring work in ensuring that the task of striving to achieve a full and ethical interpretation of that most controversial of conflicts that was the Spanish Civil War and its place within the history of modern Europe continues to be understood. It is appropriate too that we recall how long the consequences would last in Spain, the cruelty of the extrajudicial killings, the incarcerations, and the long wait for parliamentary democracy that would ensue. Now, engaging with the past may be a difficult and complex process, but it is, for citizens, ethically unavoidable. The Pacto de Olvido, imposed by political elites in Spain after the fall of Franco, signifies not just the fears that so often exist around any deep or honest reflection on a history that, in the case of the abusing elites, has much to hide. It has an incubus that yearns for an undemocratic imposition of order. And if we are to stand back and take a longer historical perspective of the events that led up to the Spanish Civil War, our gaze on the political context might initially fall on the rise of liberalism across Europe during the 19th century and the opposing voices of authoritarianism that emerged and saw in the demand for democratic participation a threat from the new voices that were challenging the previous unassailability of monarchy, nobility, and church. We can perceive how such growing democratic demands and political agitation and related organisation drew forth by way of response from that curious relationship between monarchy and dictatorship which existed throughout Europe in the 1920s, an authoritarianism that went far beyond any form of what would be later economic corporatism. We can observe too the strain on fragile democracies that were being experienced across the continent as they sought to deal with the weight of class expectations and inevitably confrontation in conditions of change. Not just the conflict between left and right political forces, but often the differences within each. Those citizens yearning for order at any cost, who had fascist sympathies, offered support in the name of such order to dictatorship, as it promised for them strong actions that would solve the consequences for their nations of a worldwide economic crisis, a crisis that was claiming lives and livelihoods all over the world. The politics of fear meant that an opportunity had emerged for the seizure of powers. The atmosphere of the strong man had arrived, and a military officer's uniform became a powerful symbol of those seizing power. It would be simplistic, however, to claim that the war that broke out in Spain on the 17th of July 1936 was ab initio a straightforward clash between forces calling themselves democratic and those of fascist intent. As with all major wars, the Spanish Civil War was the outcome of what could have been, and not just for historians, observable social forces: an impoverished and disenfranchised workforce, landholding patterns of the rich that were almost feudal, an elite intent upon maintaining their wealth and privilege, strong regional autonomy movements that offered a mask for regional elites' abuse of power, and a church newly committed to corporatism, drawing on such documents as Quadragesimo Anno, which recall Rerum Novarum 40 years earlier, which condemned what it generalized in that document as Marxism and communism. Hitler's rise to power, which had culminated 2 years before with his achievement of absolute command of Germany, together with his alliance with Mussolini and his concern to distract Western powers from his Central European strategy, resulted in nationalist rebels receiving support from Nazi Germany and fascist Italy. As to the position of other countries, despite the signing by 27 countries, including Britain, France, Germany, Italy, and the Soviet Union, of a non-intervention pact in September 1936, it was a war that was soon to take on an international dimension. Stalin, worried by the rise of fascism in Europe and the threat it presented to the Soviet Union, moved to prevent the nationalists from taking power by providing military assistance to the Republicans. Ireland's reaction to the Civil War provoked a divided response, with volunteers going to Spain to support both nationalists and Republicans. It is difficult for some even today, given the high regard to which the Irish National Brigadiers are now held in this country, to understand how it came to be that the great majority of Irishmen who fought in the Spanish Civil War did so in support of General Franco. They would gain much, I suggest, from reading the account of Ireland in the 1930s and such fine works as, for example, Thomas O'Brien's Strong Words, Brave Deeds. But we must remember, however, that support for Franco in Ireland was sourced in the conservative institutional forces dominated by a brand of clericalism, far more authoritarian than spiritual and imposed through fear. And thus many of those who decided to join the International Brigades were forced to face public opprobrium at home. Today we owe it to them to honour them all the more for that. Rather than being seen as a struggle between democracy and fascism, the Spanish Civil War was presented widely in Ireland as a conflict between Catholicism and communism. But yet, in a contradictory way, individual Catholic and non-Catholic clergymen in Northern Ireland, for example, had supported the Spanish Republic. The Catholic hierarchy's pastoral warning against the spread of left-wing ideas in Ireland, issued some years before, had clearly stated that the two beliefs, Catholicism and communism, were completely incompatible. Meanwhile, the influence of the shirt movement that would come to be known as the blue shirts, and more recently I have been reading about the blue blouses as well, continued to spread under the leadership of Eoin O'Duffy, who was an admirer of European fascism and not committed to democratic politics if it included workers entitled to agitate for their rights, as is clear in the letter he wrote to Michael Collins 3 days before the death of Collins. O'Duffy, I think as Dermot Ferreter has put it, was a mirror to the Ireland of the 20s and 30s. O'Duffy's 700-strong Irish brigade was supported by the Catholic Church. For example, the Dean of Cashel, as he sent them on the way with a blessing, said, "The Irish Brigade had gone to fight the battle of Christianity against communism." Throughout the country, too, the Churchgate collection for ambulances for Franco was the largest collection since the time of Daniel O'Connell's campaign for Catholic emancipation of the previous century. Meanwhile, like the tens of thousands of internationalists who had decided to come to the Republic's aid in Spain, many Irish men and women were moved by the distress of the democratically elected Spanish government and the suffering of civilians. They were courageous and determined, and they had to be, as for many of them getting to Spain involved the greatest difficulty and hardship, as described, for example, by the late Manus O'Riordan, who recalled his own illegal and clandestine journey through London and Paris as a difficult and long road. Most of the volunteers were smuggled in over the Pyrenees, where they received a sadly inadequate training for the war. That having been said, that war they were about to fight, they had been left under no illusion upon recruitment about the bloody and brutal battle that would lay before them. Manus O'Riordan remembers the authentic, realistic and honest description they received of what they were likely to encounter in Spain, which in fact had the effect of some of the volunteers, many for family reasons, stepping out and returning home. Among the ranks of the International Brigade was the brilliant young poet Charles Donnelly, whose final words were to become an almost iconic description of the Spanish Civil War, still remembered and quoted today, so many years after they were first uttered on the battlefields of Spain. Described by Ivan Boland as a dark star who can haunt a generation, Charles Donnelly, about whom contemporary poet and critic Gerald Daw has written so movingly, was just 22 years of age when he decided to come to the aid of Republican Spain. Donnelly, with hundreds of men from the International Brigades, fought in one of the bloodiest confrontations between Republican and Nationalist forces, that of the Battle of Jarama, which took place just 7 weeks after his arrival in Spain. It was here, during a lull in machine gun fire, and just moments before a bullet was shot into his temple, that Charles Donnelly plucked a bunch of olives from the dust and, squeezing them, spoke the 5 simple words that still echo poignantly across the decades: even the olives are bleeding. At Jarama, a battle took place that, in the works of Cathal O'Shannon many years later, was to epitomise war in all its horror. Here the Irish and British battalions fought side by side and suffered huge casualties, yet achieving one of their finest hours as they played their brave role in thwarting an attempt by Franco's forces to encircle Madrid. 10 days after his death, Charles Donnelly's body, face fresh, naive-looking, as it was described, was buried beneath one of those olive trees in that land far away from his native Tyrone. His family, left unaware of his death for some time, his distressed father unable to talk about him for years. And that turns something else that is important. It is important to recall that support for the Spanish Republic drew alliances, I repeat, across religions in Northern Ireland. The imposed silence of the relatives, however, the relatives of the lost at that time, remains as moving now to recall as it was understandable in its time. Sadly, such silence was not unusual. Many of those who died so bravely for freedom were marginalised back home in Ireland for many years. Many had their teaching posts taken from them. I recall my conversations with the late great socialist Frank Edwards, for example, and Communist Party spokesman Eugene McCartan, describing the anguish and despair of those who lost sons to anti-fascist forces in the Spanish Civil War, said, "To be attached to someone who died was not safe in Ireland. The Catholic Church made a rallying cry for fascists and held collections to support Franco. It was no wonder families kept their heads down." However, while O'Duffy's Irish Brigade was comprised wholly of Roman Catholics, we must not forget that many committed Catholics fought with the International Brigade, seeing no conflict between their religious beliefs and the support of Jesus and the spirit of solidarity which drove them to fight and, in some cases, sacrifice their lives for democracy in Spain. Frank Ryan, leader of the Irish contingent of the brigade, wrote when completing a questionnaire on his arrival at the concentration camp of San Pedro de Cadena that he had come to Spain for 2 reasons. One, to aid a democratic government, and the other because he believed that religion was not at stake in the Spanish Civil War, and he wanted to show that O'Duffy did not represent the Irish people. The Ireland of the 1930s that produced these opposing forces was an Ireland that was experiencing the extremes of authoritarianism, imposed on a broken people, I believe myself, for be it in relation to culture, dance, books, moral panics against communism and fear. It is, for example, the time of the imposition of the Dance Halls Act of 1934, the dismissal of the librarian in Mayo, the deportation of Jimmy Crawlton, and you could go on, of censorship, of, if you like, the exclusion of people from teaching posts. If it had not been for the state having some small elements of recruitment through the vocational education system, many would not have been able to resume their work as teachers. The character, the motivation, and what drove the members of the Irish International Brigade in such a context, with its mix of socialists, idealists, communists, and men of all religions and none, can perhaps be best summed up in the words of the late Paddy O'Dare, a leader of the International Brigade, who said, "All causes are worldwide. Freedom is indivisible. If a man fights for freedom in one place, he is fighting for it everywhere. In the urge to defend the Spanish Republic, they invoked internationalism and a shared humanism that was full of hope and that was construed as a threat to the absolutism and the imposed certainties of the time. Bogus certainties. The response to them was vicious. For a cause, cog croga, agus searf a fiam, agus an erad a dala cuirig na mílta con bois, agus na mília con díbartha as con prisún, agus na teagach dus do glún umlán, fós na cheach fwy blow I máisiún goin láhach. It was to be a brave and bitter fight, culminating in an ungenerous defeat, which saw thousands executed, 1 million people exiled or imprisoned, and a generation denied the right to live, grow and flourish in a democratic nation. Today, the people of Spain continue to grapple with transacting the story and the legacy of a civil war which is undoubtedly the most important chapter of its 20th century history. It is a chapter which has left a profound legacy, with many citizens still engaged years later in a continuing search for contact with our past, a past that, as so often elsewhere perhaps, because of the pain, or on the other hand guilt, not discussed at home and often left out of the history books studied in classrooms. We, of course, ourselves are challenged shortly to deal ethically with our own experience of civil war. And here in Ireland, as we have been engaging in the ongoing decade of commemorations, we have been called upon to reflect on the challenge of remembering ethically. Such remembrance must always aspire to respect complexity, but also to vindicate principle and to seek to understand how, as they constructed it for themselves and in their own times, what drove the integrity and the motivations of the men and women from the past. Not an easy task. And that ethical remembering remains a challenge for Spain, as for us, and for many nations around the globe, if a just and enduring peaceful future is to be achieved. As the world continues to face conflict, poverty, and abuse of power, we are called upon to re-invoke, to continue to try and discover in so many cases, to show moral courage and be willing in our words and policies to demonstrate a sense of true internationalism. If we are to overcome together the forces of greed, intolerance and oppression, which deny so many of our fellow global citizens of their right to justice and freedom, it can only then be with alarm that 80 years after the beginning of the Spanish Civil War, we see xenophobic, extreme forms of nationalistic and inward-looking movements gaining traction again in mainstream politics right across Europe. If we are to tackle the growing divisions within the international community, it is important that we focus our efforts anew on building social cohesion and solidarity. In the centenary year of the Republican uprising of 1916, and the 80th anniversary of fascism's attack on the Spanish Republic, we should recall the origins and aims of true republicanism and strive to continue to show the strength of conviction, moral courage and generosity that was shared among those who fought in the International Brigade. The inspiring spirit of humanity that defined the International Brigades has never, perhaps, been more movingly articulated than in that great farewell speech of the Spanish Republican Dolores Ibárruri, or La Pasionaria, as she is better known. Addressing them at the final parade in Barcelona in October 1938, she said, "From all peoples, from all races, you came to us like brothers, like sons of immortal Spain. And in the hardest days of the war, when the capital of the Spanish Republic was threatened, it was you, gallant comrades of the International Brigades, who helped save the city with your fighting enthusiasm, your heroism, and your spirit of sacrifice." The volunteers who joined the brigades from across Europe and beyond set an example of international solidarity and global citizenship, which today we need to continue to inspire us, those who bravely march alongside the downtrodden, the excluded and the marginalised, and who battle against inequality in all its forms. Those who are fighting for justice and freedom in communities and societies across the globe. Those who work to give meaning and greater depth, to give authenticity to the demand for democracy for all. Is cordon marnashon, a bheith anabrodol as na firis maná croge ernach, a hueglis na brigad adanashunta, sa blian sin nédia trocha sé, agus is min love shiva walu, as a nabaratá siúl agi le cuidna, agus a lúcan a níhi chred, wacan caha in Spáine, son na sir sin ach áit a cunial bio. As a nation, we can be very proud of the brave Irish men and women who joined the International Brigade in 1936. May I commend you, therefore, for the work you do in keeping alive the memory and the values of all those who bravely fought for freedom everywhere, as they put it, on the battlefields of Spain almost 80 years ago. Viva la Quinta Brigada!